I just like to take any opportunity I can to talk about plants. Today I'm going to talk about eutrophication, except I'm going to talk about it in terms of its effect on aquatic plants because I feel like that's not really a topic that's talked about a lot. It's usually talked about in terms of its impact on water quality, human health, and obviously animal health. And although those are incredibly important, I also think that understanding the impact on aquatic plants is important as well. So I'm going to start with a quick review on what eutrophication is. Eutrophication is the process in which excess nutrients is given into an ecosystem. Most ecosystems have a limiting nutrient, and so when you put in excess nutrients and it makes it so that that nutrient isn't limiting anymore, which means that it's not in low concentrations anymore, we see a variety of different impacts. Particularly in eutrophication, we're usually talking about algal blooms caused by increased phosphorus. And so phosphorus is one of the nutrients that plants require to grow, and so do algae. And so plants and cyanobacteria require three general nutrients in large quantities to thrive. Those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These nutrients are input into a body of water, and what that causes is an algal bloom. Algae, which is usually cyanobacteria, that's of great interest because it is produces neurotoxins and other toxins that are incredibly harmful to animals and people. It increases in abundance like crazy. This algae then photosynthesizes, and eventually light can't penetrate through, it dies, and when this algae dies, it's decomposed by the decomposers in the lake. Through decomposition, the oxygen in the lake is depleted because that's required for decomposition. And as this oxygen is depleted, it creates what's called a hypoxic zone. And what that means is that there's little to no available dissolved oxygen in the body of water. And for the animals that require that dissolved oxygen, they can't survive. That's what we're talking about generally when we're talking about eutrophication. And although we usually talk about it in terms of algal blooms, specifically cyanobacteria, it can also come about in terms of an increase in aquatic plant population. The aquatic plant population can increase to a point where it just smothers out everything else. But that is a kind of different topic that I'm not really going to focus on here because the general focus is usually cyanobacteria blooms, especially near human populations because of the toxicity. So there are two general mechanisms that we can talk about when we're talking about the impact of algal blooms on aquatic plants. Those two mechanisms proposed are, first one being light penetration. And so when that cyanobacteria coats the top of the water, it gets murky and gross and thick and the light can't get through, and the aquatic plants at the bottom just aren't getting enough sunlight. And so because they can't photosynthesize and they need to photosynthesize to produce food, they die off. And now the second mechanism is a little bit more indirect. And so that is the impact of the algal bloom on the fish species that then impact the aquatic plants. And this is through what is called a trophic cascade. And what that is it's pretty much when an impact on one species impacts other populations in the food web. And so larger fish, piscivores, for example, that eat other fish, may be more at risk during low oxygen levels. Those low oxygen levels that I talked about at the end of the eutrophication cycle, when those cyanobacteria are being decomposed and those hypoxic zones are created. And so because of that depleted oxygen and because these species are more at risk, you have those species dying out first. And so when you get the predators of the smaller fish that eat the aquatic plants, when those predators are gone, those fish that then aren't at risk of dying because of low oxygen, they boom. And so they increase in population size because there's nobody to eat them, and then they eat the aquatic plants, and that aquatic plant population decreases, and that's how we kind of get that cascade of effects. Now, other than just decreasing the presence of aquatic plants, the algal blooms also impact the plant diversity. Rarer plants aren't as prevalent in those ecosystems that are eutrophic as they are in normal, stable ecosystems. And because the plants that can benefit from the eutrophic conditions, that increase in nutrients, are going to boom. And so if they're able to take advantage of it, they will take advantage of it. Now, why are aquatic plants even important? Why do we care? The answer to the question kind of lies in how we view terrestrial plants, because we view crop plants and terrestrial habitats as incredibly important. And we kind of sometimes forget that aquatic plants are also really important in terms of food sources for humans and animals, and as aesthetic values, as well as cultural values, let alone its impact as the foundation of these aquatic ecosystems. And as well, they are incredibly important at nutrient cycling in those ecosystems. And so they're able to take that nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, as well as possible pollutants like heavy metals into themselves through a variety of processes and turn them into food for the rest of the ecosystem, or in terms of the pollutants, process them in a way through possibly bacteria that they are associated with to make them less harmful to the ecosystem, or at least take them out of the water body itself. That's why they're important. It's a variety of different ways, and it's very similar to terrestrial plants. It's just the fact that, they're in a lake or a river or an estuary. And now I don't really want to leave you with kind of that pessimistic view of all this information about what's going wrong and not really tell you what we can do to help or how to mitigate these issues. And two of the main ways proposed are, the first one being mitigating nitrogen and phosphorus input to these ecosystems. And so although phosphorus is usually the main focus that we associate with eutrophication, we also need to focus on nitrogen, because depending on the ecosystem or the water body, different nutrients can be limiting. And so they found that especially in coastal or estuary type ecosystems, that it's not always phosphorus that is limiting, it's nitrogen. And so when you focus on phosphorus but you don't address the nitrogen issue, then you can actually have more issues in different areas. And so the proposed mechanism of mitigating that is to reduce the amount of phosphate containing and nitrogen containing compounds that are getting into our sewage and fertilizer. For example, in the past couple decades, we have moved away from using phosphate salts in detergents and such, because those were shown to really impact algal blooms in freshwater lakes. And so we wanted to mitigate that. But we also need to focus on nitrogen as well, especially in coastal and estuary communities. The second one, in terms of how we can help the problem of eutrophication, has to do with ecosystem engineering. They can do this in a variety of ways. They can physically alter the ecosystem in order to increase water flow. They can also add species into the ecosystem in order to either fill roles or replace roles in the food web that may have been removed or dampened by the effects of eutrophication. And then there's also the adding of certain chemicals in order to increase the oxygen levels in that body of water. But the problem with this aspect or this approach is that it's after the fact, it's after the damage, and it's costly. It can only be applied on a small scale. And in general, it's very risky, because when you're messing with ecosystem dynamics, you can't always see the end result. So the biggest thing that we do need to do is reduce at the beginning. It's looked at these sources of nitrogen and phosphorus and really pinpoint them in terms of our products and our waste. But that's pretty much it for me. That's my cup of tea for this week. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you learned a little something about eutrophication and its impact on plants. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.